There are two kids who grew up in the same house, with the same parents, eating dinner at the same table every night for 18 years. And somehow, one of them calls every Sunday without fail, and the other hasn't called in over a year. Same house, same parents, same childhood, more or less. And two completely different relationships with the woman who raised them both. Maybe one still comes for every holiday, sits in the same chair, brings the kids, asks about your doctor's appointments. And the other one sends a polite text on your birthday, if that, and you've stopped being able to predict whether this Thanksgiving will include him or not. If you're a mother sitting with that exact contradiction, I want you to know that it confuses you for a reason, and there's real psychology behind why it happens, even when it feels like it shouldn't be possible. My name is Margaret. I'm a mother and a grandmother, and today I want to talk about something that doesn't get discussed nearly as much as parent-child estrangement on its own, but that so many of you have written to me about. What happens when one child stays close and another quietly drifts away inside the very same family? Here in America today, research on sibling differences in family closeness has found something that surprises a lot of parents the first time they hear it. Children raised in the same household with the same parents do not, in fact, experience the same childhood. Researchers who study this call it non-shared environment, and it turns out to account for far more of a child's adult personality and relational patterns than most people assume. Birth order changes things. The parent's financial stress in one child's early years versus another's. A divorce that happened when one sibling was 7 and the other was 16, landing on each of them in completely different developmental windows. Even something as simple as which sibling happened to share more interests with you, the parent, creating slightly more natural ease in that particular relationship. None of this means you loved one child more. It means two children, raised under the same roof, were actually raised in two subtly different families, shaped by two different versions of you at two different points in your own life. Here's what almost no one tells parents going through this, and it's worth sitting with for a moment. The sibling who stays close is not automatically the one who had it easier, and the sibling who pulls away is not automatically the one who had it harder. Family researchers who study estrangement have found that the more emotionally sensitive child in a family is often, counterintuitively, more likely to become estranged, not because anything dramatic happened to them specifically, but because they register and retain emotional friction more vividly than a sibling with a different temperament does. The same ordinary parenting moment, the same offhand comment, the same busy week where you couldn't make it to every recital, lands completely differently on a child wired to absorb relational nuance than it does on a sibling who simply moves on by dinner time. This is not a character flaw in either child. It's closer to two different nervous systems processing the identical event. Now, I want to be honest with you about a pattern that researchers have documented and that tends to be one of the hardest parts of this particular kind of split. The sibling who remains close often becomes, without ever asking for the role, the keeper of the official family narrative. The version of events where things were generally fine, where the parents tried hard, where the estranged sibling is the one who's being difficult or always was sensitive. This isn't usually malicious. It's simply easier to maintain closeness with a story that doesn't require examining painful moments too closely. But researchers who study family systems have found that this dynamic, where one sibling's account becomes the family's official truth, frequently deepens the distance with the sibling who left because it confirms exactly what made them leave in the first place, the sense that their version of events was never going to be taken seriously. I want to pause here and say something gently, because I know this is painful to hear if you recognize it. If you've leaned more heavily on the child who stayed, asking them to explain or interpret their sibling's behavior, or relying on them for the version of events that feels less unsettling, this is an extremely human response to grief and confusion. It's also, according to the research, one of the quiet things that can make repair with the distant child harder, because it positions the close sibling as a kind of spokesperson for the parent's side. Family therapists who work with these splits often recommend something that sounds small but tends to matter enormously. making sure the closer sibling never becomes the unofficial mediator or messenger between you and the one who's gone quiet. That role, even when taken on willingly, tends to strain both relationships at once. Here's something else worth knowing, because it affects more families than people realize. The sibling who stays close sometimes carries a quieter, less visible weight of their own. Researchers who study families with one estranged member have found that the remaining child frequently experiences what's been called survivor's guilt within the family, a sense of unease about being the favored or easier relationship, sometimes accompanied by pressure to overperform closeness to make up for what's missing. Some of these children describe feeling like they have to be twice as present, twice as available, twice as warm, simply to balance out an absence that isn't actually theirs to balance. If you have a child who calls every Sunday without fail, it's worth occasionally asking whether some of that consistency comes from genuine ease, and whether some of it comes from a sense of obligation they've quietly taken on because someone in the family needs to be the one who shows up. There's a related pattern worth naming directly because parents rarely notice they're doing it. Comparing the two siblings out loud, even gently, even with good intentions, tends to do more damage than parents expect. A passing comment like, "at least you call," or "I wish your brother was more like you," might feel, in the moment, like simple gratitude toward the child who's present. But researchers who study sibling dynamics within estranged families have found that these comparisons often land on the present child as pressure rather than praise, reinforcing the very role assignment that can make an eventual reconciliation between siblings, or between you and the distant child, feel even more loaded. The present child starts representing not just themselves, but a contrast, and contrasts are heavy things to carry inside a family that's already grieving an absence. Across the United States, this exact pattern, one adult child remaining close while a sibling goes distant, is one of the most common shapes that family estrangement actually takes, even though most of the conversation around this topic focuses only on the parent-child relationship in isolation. What the research increasingly shows is that the sibling relationship itself often becomes collateral damage in these situations. Brothers and sisters who were close as children sometimes drift from each other too, not because of any conflict between them directly, but because one of them has become, by default, the family's remaining point of contact, while the other has stepped fully outside the system. Reconnecting siblings, researchers note, can sometimes become an unexpected bridge back toward the parent as well, because siblings often have an easier time reaching each other without the weight of the original parent-child history attached. If you have a child who's still close to their estranged sibling, even informally, that relationship may be carrying more potential for eventual repair than any direct effort you make yourself. If you have a child who's still close to their estranged sibling, even informally, that relationship may be carrying more potential for eventual repair than any direct effort you make yourself. This shows up most visibly, by the way, in exactly the moments you'd expect: holidays, birthdays. The empty or filled chair at the table becomes a kind of yearly scoreboard nobody asked for, and family researchers note that parents in this situation often unconsciously start treating the holiday itself differently depending on who's attending, lavishing more emotional energy on making the present child's visit special, partly out of gratitude, partly out of a worry that any sign of disappointment about the missing one might somehow drive the present child away too. This is an understandable instinct. It's also worth naming because the child who shows up consistently deserves a relationship with you that isn't quietly shaped around managing the absence of someone else. I want to leave you with something that the longitudinal research on this keeps confirming, because it tends to get lost in the day-to-day pain of this particular split. Families are not required to heal in one single motion, with everyone reconciled at the same table at the same time. Repair, when it happens, often happens unevenly, one relationship at a time, sometimes starting with the sibling connection rather than the parent connection, sometimes the other way around. You don't have to solve the whole family at once. You don't have to get the sibling who's close to convince the one who isn't. You simply have to keep being a parent who's reachable without asking either child to carry messages they didn't sign up to carry. If this is part of your story, tell me in the comments how it's shown up in your own family and whether the sibling who stayed close has ever talked to you about what that role has cost them too. So many of you are holding two very different relationships with two children from the very same childhood, and there is real comfort in knowing how many other tables in how many other homes across this country are sitting with that exact same uneven shape tonight.